Yeah, okay, so now we have our third speaker for this session, Lee Hickin from Microsoft Asia. He's also presenting online. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. Audio is coming through good. Thank you for the opportunity to address this audience and talk to you a little bit about how Microsoft is thinking about building models for AI governance, and then more broadly, how we need to think about the global coherence of those governance models to ensure that we're building something that matters for everybody and not just for individual countries. My job at Microsoft is the AI tech and policy lead, which essentially means my job is about bringing meaningful connections between technology and the development of the policy and governance that is there to govern that technology. It's quite a new role at Microsoft, and I come from an engineering background, though. It was interesting listening to Kitano-san's session. I now regret not having more Xbox footage in my presentation, but I will know for next time to make sure I include videos of our gaming systems as well. But a very interesting session. So with that, let me begin by starting really with a point of view around trust. And this session today, this section of the day is about societal values, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that we really can't build on those societal values unless we build trust in the technology. And so I want to share with you some statistics, and there's a full report behind this. But this was a report conducted by KPMG and the University of Queensland here in Australia. It was a global study, 17,000 people around the world across 17 countries, with the fundamental questions being asked around how do people feel in terms of their attitude and their trust towards AI. Now you can see the main numbers on the screen there kind of really tell a simple story, which is that very, very many people are concerned about the potential risks of AI. And I think that's an expected measure and a metric we would anticipate. And at the same time, an almost commensurate amount of people are also willing to put more trust in AI if we had the right ethical assurance mechanisms in place. A couple of details from the report itself that you can feel free to click on the link as you get these slides later. So fundamentally, people expect AI to be regulated in much the same way that we regulate many, many core industries, risk-dependent industries around the world. Broad numbers, 2 in 5 people believe that we have sufficient guardrails in place today. So as expected, very few people think we have the right amount of guardrails. Digging a little deeper into that, though, what is interesting, although perhaps maybe not too surprising, at the top of that, we have India and China, who believe are the most likely countries to believe that we have appropriate safeguards in place. Coming in at around 80% of their respondents agreed that we have appropriate safeguards. The lowest or least convinced countries around the world happen to be Japan and South Korea, coming in at around 14% agreement that we have appropriate safeguards. So Japanese people are a very skeptical people, it would seem, on the safeguards we have today. But fundamentally, trust is key to unlocking the opportunity that we see in front of us with AI. And to my view, governance is the application of a process in which people can trust. So governance becomes critical to trust, which becomes critical to society's approach and values and acceptance of AI as a technology. So with that as a basis, I want to talk a bit about Microsoft's journey to do this, how we're building our approach to governance internally, and shed some light on some of that you may not have seen independently. So the slide you're looking at now is our journey over the last, now coming up to 8 years of work in responsible AI. So governance for us is about people and about process. And our work, therefore, in building that governance has been a combination of building a culture, and I'll talk more about that concept of culture when I look at the mechanisms, and then the actual mechanisms themselves, the tools and processes we use to enforce or operate that governance. One of the really important things we learned on this journey is governance of AI is not always about compliance to a checkbox, but about compliance to a set of processes that ensure you are looking at the right challenges, the right risks, the right harms, and the right mitigations on that journey. So this is not new for us. We've been doing it for quite some time, and we continue to do this. It is an ongoing journey, and we try and share as much of this as possible as assets into the open source community. all of this work took place long before the explosion of generative AI. And so there are some very specific things around generative AI that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this session, given its importance in the market today. The other point I want to make before we dive into some of the mechanisms of this is this concept of shared responsibility. And I've heard words like this come out through many of the sessions today, this question of who takes responsibility and how do they take responsibility. At a technical level, at our operating level of AI, and this is quite aligned to the Hiroshima process guiding principles, is two core bodies of activities inside that AI world. Those that are building AI, the developers, and those that are deploying AI as the operators of business applications, services, and tools. And sometimes they're the same entity. But it's the combination of those two entities coming together to build sets of rules, processes, codes, and conduct that will define the mechanisms for safe and trustworthy AI. Neither one can be doing this independently. Both need to come together. So like many organizations and now many countries around the world, we took a very simple principled approach to this as we started the journey for thinking about how we build AI. The principles, as you see them here, would seem very straightforward and probably align to all of the countries or organizations that you all represent today. And it's fair to say that the top four, fairness, reliability, privacy, inclusiveness, would be largely applicable to any form of technology that we bring to bear on society as a whole. Transparency and accountability become the ones that really underpin the needs of an AI-infused world because they so fundamentally address the challenges, the risks, and the societal harms we see with AI today, which boils down to what is this AI doing and who is responsible for how it operates? And by virtue of that, who can control how it operates and what it does and how it works with me? So everything we've built is foundationally built on these 6 principles, and we have found them to be very durable, not just in the traditional sort of discriminative AI world, but also in the generative AI world, although often some of the mechanisms need to change with generative AI. The next point I want to land on is the criticality of being able to enact governance being so completely tied to a leadership-led approach, or at least in operation, ensuring that leadership is driving, owning, and is in control, is bought into this idea of the need for responsible AI. The structure here in Microsoft is exactly as you see here. So from the board, where we have this very much as a board set of mechanics, and the board is responsible for how we run AI. Executive leadership owns that, and you would see, I hope, through their mechanisms in the general world, that people like Kevin Scott, Satya Nadella, and Brad Smith and others are very visible in that execution of that leadership. And then it's the Office of Responsible AI, which is the body of the business that I sit within, that is split across the 3 core functions that we perform in our operations around AI, which is to contribute to global research, papers, and continued academic work, to support the development of policy, both internally and externally in the company, and then to ensure that what we are building at an engineering level fits and adheres to those principles and the mechanisms that we put in place. The pull-out point here is that the Office of Responsible AI is not owned by any one segment of the business. It's not a risk management process. It's not a financially operated process. It's not an engineering operated process. It is a leadership process that reaches into all of those parts of the business and ensures it operates in an ombudsman-like model where it has governing responsibility across the whole business and isn't tied to any one particular outcome that you would expect a business to have. So let's dive into more specific details on the actual governance model. So what you'll see here is the 4 elements of that, and this should become immediately familiar to anyone who's looked at the NIST Responsible AI framework as a basis, because that's exactly what we have built our model upon. And there's a message in there which is, thinking longer term about this, building on foundational standard processes like the NIST framework is critical to global coherence for an AI governance system. And it was interesting, and of course, a great thing to see that at the end of April, I think this year, NIST posted a crosswalk between both the NIST framework and the now Japanese AI guidelines for business. And Singapore has also done the same to ensure that we're all kind of building consistent models for operations of AI around the world, even though we had built it with local requirements in place. So this is the model we use, the NIST model. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll break it down into some of its key components. In the center of it, and fundamentally the core of it, is this concept of govern. And we'll come back to this as a process, but it's the mechanism that conceptualizes the mapping, the measurement, and the management ongoing of any AI systems across the business. So for us, this is about implementing policies and practices that drive a culture of risk management. So this is fundamental to any organization, whether it be a business like us, a multi-stakeholder operation like the UN or OECD, or in individual countries and governing processes around AI, is building a culture of risk management, because what AI fundamentally introduces, something that businesses have been very comfortable with for many years, which is the management and mitigation of risk. There is no mechanism today in the AI that we're building and operating that simply makes AI safe or not safe. It is simply a management process of risk across the board, and that risk is measured and managed through the tools. So that's the fundamental piece. Governing is about building a policy, building a culture of risk, but it's also then about building documentation and continual sort of investment in processes that record what is happening, record what was done, record what has changed, and give us the tools that we need to provide that ongoing measurement. So again, it's something very almost manual and human in its concept, which is this sort of human records of the AI system or the AI tools becomes the cornerstone of our governing process. As we walk around that circle, then we look at mapping, which is the first and critical step, and it's essentially a process of understanding the big picture. It avoids that mindset of not falling into a situation where we have someone saying, not my problem, so someone else will deal with it, or just as bad, that's somebody else's problem, I know they will deal with it, where we see this sort of breakdown between engineering and business and finance goals being misaligned in any organization. That process of mapping it takes us across all of that, so we see the whole picture. For us, we have tools like responsible AI impact assessments, tools that allow us to record and measure the impact of AI, not just in the context of its usage, but its broader impact if it was to, say, be used in other areas or other parts of our business. And that's all built around a standardized mechanism for reporting and recording of that data. In fact, all of this is stored in what we call an AISI, our AI systems inventory, where we have a dedicated mechanism for recording AI-specific implementations of technology. And of course, then there are tools like red teaming and other privacy security reviews that operate in and around that process of mapping that. When we think about measuring it, and this is really critical, and again, something that is so obvious in saying it, but is so important as we think about it, is you simply can't manage what you can't measure. And so if we're not measuring the quantitative, qualitative, or both impact and outcomes of AI, then we are unable to manage that over time. So it's about employing a series of mechanisms to do that measurement of the environment. And there's two things here, which is about measuring things like identified risks. So, we have metrics that are out there to determine what we know to be the core risks of generative AI. And you've heard other speakers today talk about those very specific, areas of that risk might be bias, harm, might be proliferation of false facts. It might be more specifically around jailbreaks and exploits and so on. But we also have to think about the unidentified risks that are out there. So we're looking for patterns. We start to see things like chain of thought redirection modeling in transformer-based models, where we can lead the model to behave a particular way based on a series of chain of thought interactions that we might have with that model. So it's both what we can see and what we can't see. And in the security world, we would think about that as being threat and zero-day risks. We also need to put in place and measure the mitigations against risk. So when we identify a risk and we put in place a mitigation, whether that's a change to the meta prompt or system messaging to force the model to behave differently, we have to measure that impact. Is it changing the model behavior? And that's, again, is quite something that's very specific to generative AI, not something we've had to think about with other technical systems, because typically technical systems behave one way on day one and continue to behave that way on day 572, whereas AI systems, particularly generative models, are continually adapting and are being change through the chain of thought or the interactions they have with individual users. So measuring is a really critical part of maintaining the life cycle of this. So then as we get to manage, we think about managing this system. This is functionally exactly what you imagine it to be. It's the sort of the end process that puts in place the tools to ensure that we are governing AI correctly. One way to think about this managed stage is it's about determining how much resource we put into the individual governing functions that we need to set up as needed to map against the measured risks we identified in the measure stage. And it's about making sure that we apply the most amount of focus on the highest level of risk. And this will be very consistent with how we're seeing things like the EU AI Act roll out, or the Canadian AI ADA Act, which is all about high risk management and understanding where risk is employed with AI. We need to build the most amount of rigidity and control, guardrails and safety systems in that kind of tool. And that's exactly what we do. The other thing that's really important here, which leads back to this idea of human in the loop, is the user agency, and ensuring that both the users of AI are clearly aware of the fact that they're using and interacting with an AI system, as well as transparently the people building the AI understand the risks and the reason why those risk mitigations are put in place. It's all embedded in that transparency and user agency function that is so critical to this management phase of AI. So that builds us a governing model on how we operate it. We then have to think a bit more deeply about, more specifically, how do we deal with those high risks? So again, if you think about what we've seen in the EU AI Act and other defining AI systems today, this idea that we need to categorize risk, and risk being about the context of AI in its use case. We've employed a system called sensitive uses, which allows us to take some of those risks of AI and apply a deeper level of assessment, a deeper level of investigation into that risk, and in some cases to prohibit that particular use. For example, facial recognition in surveillance type scenarios or broad social surveillance systems. So we've chosen these three. These are our three. I think the 1 and 2, consequential impact on legal rights and life opportunities, would align very much to things like access to systems in the criminal justice system, access to credit, social welfare, education systems, and things like that. Physical and psychological injury would be fairly straightforward in the sense that this is about, say, physical systems or cyber-physical systems that employ AI, where there's a risk of a human being impacted in a physical way or a psychological way. And of course, the most fundamental one would be to align to those human rights based principles that we expect to see and prohibit largely the use of AI in areas, things like predictive policing, social credit scoring, that kind of area, or political propaganda. And this for us is a mechanism of building in additional governance processes for the most highest risk sensitive usage. I want to quickly talk about how we think about building some of those mechanisms in place, those sort of safety controls. One of the key points to make here is when we think about generative AI specifically, it's really important that we build those safety mechanisms outside of the model itself and outside of the application layer that the model sits within. We think largely about loosely coupled, agile, and adaptable architectures. And the reason for doing that is we need to decouple safety mechanisms from models, because they both are operating at different paces and in different directions. Model development is largely driven by scientific, computational reasoning and technology levers. Safety is measured against human agency, human rights, and individual countries' laws and policies around concepts like privacy and IP and so on. So we're very much focusing on this idea that we need to separate these three things out, ensure that we are not doing them in one big box, which makes it very hard to govern, and be agile in how we govern that. So the last thing I want to share with you on this topic, and then I'll quickly move to my last piece on general global governance, is the QR code you see on the screen there will give you access to download a transparency report. So I've just raced through these elements of this in 10 minutes. This report is a complete directed report on how we're doing all of those parts and how we operate the pieces of our business to deliver on those components. It's a part of our commitment to the White House executive order, our voluntary commitments on AI, to deliver this annual report, and we're happy to share it here with the audience. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about a broader global view. We all understand that as what Microsoft is doing as a company, or what any other company is doing, or what any government intra-country government is doing, can't be done in isolation. And we need to think about AI as a globally required governance process. So we recently did some work to look across existing global governance mechanisms that exist today in the world. So across civil aviation, across CERN and the nuclear energy market, or across other very impactful. And I think it was interesting, my peer Kitano-san previously mentioned about AI being a bit like nuclear fuel, and the models being a bit like the sort of the reactors. And I think that's a really interesting analogy, because it is exactly the same thing. Tremendous opportunity, tremendous potential for human development on the planet, but also significant and important risks that need to be assessed. And so we looked across those models to see what can we take from them that we can bring to the AI narrative. So 3 things came out of that, one of which is globally significant risk governance. So international collaboration on monitoring and responding to these things. The AI is not a boundary or a bordered technology. It is an international technology, and therefore we need to think about risks at an international level. With that comes regulatory interoperability, and the making sure that domestic guidelines align with international guidelines. And I have to commend the Japanese G7 seat of last year and the work they did in building the Hiroshima AI principles as being an incredibly powerful and growingly valuable piece of regulatory interoperability that persists in the market. And then, of course, that inclusiveness, the idea that this has to work for all, not just for some. And I think that ties back to the comments around ethical AI previously. So looking very much at how do we take that forward, and this is my last slide, we take those 3 pieces and think about where do we go with them. There's a couple of things in here, lots of words on the slide, but I want to call out 2 things that I think are the most critical pieces. One of which, and again, I know Japan is a key contributor to this, and we've seen also Korea, the UK, US, Australia, and many other countries. This establishment of a global network of AI safety institutes whose primary function is to share, collaborate, and learn and develop safety principles, safety mechanisms, and safety controls around AI is going to be critical to us developing this at a global level, not just at a singular country level. And lastly, on that regulatory interoperability, very heartening to see the continued work of the G7's, the Hiroshima AI principles be adopted not just by the G7, but now by the Friends of Hiroshima, and that work continuing on into the OECDs and its implementation of that. I think these are critical steps towards building bipartisan, non-politicized frameworks for a global approach to AI governance that will be absolutely invaluable for how we think about balancing that risk and that opportunity that AI presents to us in the future. So I will leave you on that slide and leave you with this other last QR code, which is where you can download an entire copy of that goals and lessons for AI on global governance. The QR code will take you to that. I hope what I've shared with you here gives you some insight into how Microsoft is developing an approach to AI governance, but also gives you some thoughts around how we might start to contribute collectively to a global development of AI governance mechanisms that balance that need for safety and harm reduction against the opportunity for both global advancement and more positive inclusion of the world. Once again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any question?
Hello.
No
Thank you very
questions.
much for the
Hello.
very nice talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the very nice talk. It's very nice to see that big companies like Microsoft are taking this topic seriously. Still, it feels like those sort of ethical AI developments are somehow lagging behind the algorithmic developments and innovations of AI and Gen AI in particular. There is an innovation every week. And there are some people like Elon Musk, for example, who think that we should slow down technological progress for the benefit of maybe maturing those kind of ethical guidelines. And other people like Jan Lega, for example, who think that that would be very dangerous. What is your opinion on this?
So a very simple question to answer, huh? So look, it's a very well made point that algorithmic and scientific research in AI is moving much faster than policy, law, and regulation will ever catch up. And to a certain degree, I think we have to accept that that's actually not a bad thing, in so much as I think rushed laws lead to bad laws. And to the point I made earlier, I don't think what we need to be worrying about is building laws and rules that prevent the continued research of technology. I think what we really need to be thinking about is slowing down or putting some control mechanisms into where we employ that AI. So it's one thing to do research and science to discover what AI can do for us, but if we then pick that up and think about putting it into our healthcare, our education, our energy systems or transportation systems, that's where we need to put additional care. And I'm not saying slow down on that, but I'm saying we need to think deeply about the risks in that part. And that's why I made my point, which is loosely couple the application of safety protections and guardrails and contextual management of AI from the technology itself. Let's not build laws that govern technology. Let's build laws that protect society.
Okay, thank you. It's about time. If you is a quick one, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, how would you think that Microsoft plays a role in addressing risks proactively that cannot be quantified? You have stated that we can only manage the risks that we are able to calculate, measure. What about the risks that are brought with AI, which transforms an industry, and the ways in which, for instance, we have in education, right? We change so many of the processes in which we should be evaluating and measuring these technologies and their impact.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and thank you for catching me out on my own statement as I made it in my session. Look, it's a fair point, and I think as we look to some of those areas, one of the things that comes to mind is the perfection is the enemy of progress. And so I agree that in some ways we do need to think about the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know is going to happen, but they are often the only way to get to those is by progressive experimentation. And so one of the fundamentals actually of our measure and manage mechanism in the NIST framework is in building out what do we call it? Essentially circles of deployment, so that we are doing smaller field tests and then larger field tests and then more, and giving ourselves the mechanism to either go slightly faster or pull back when we start to hit some of those, as you say, the unknown risks that may be out there. But it's really the only way to address unknown is to experiment and test. And it, kind of, I'll finish on a point which is a proverb I come back to very often. At the end of the day, we could do nothing. We could just sit on AI and say, look, it was a great scientific experiment, but it's just too risky to do anything in society with it because we don't know what will happen. So let's not do anything. And it's kind of like the statement that is, ships are incredibly safe when they're tied up in a harbor, but that's not what ships are built for. Ships are built to sail. And so by the same virtue, AI is not built to be tied up in academic research where we just learn about what could be done. We actually have to bring it to the world to figure out what it could do for us in the longer term.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Lee, for.
No worries, thank you.